Welcome to another edition of the Last Negroes at Harvard podcast. I'm Kent Garrett. There were 18 of us in the Harvard College class of 1963. We are all over 83 years old now, and for the last 5 years we have produced a weekly podcast. Today our guest is David McNally. He teaches at the University of Houston, where he holds the D.E.H. Cullen Chair in History and Business, and he directs the Project on Race and Capitalism. His new book is titled Slavery and Capitalism, A New Marxist History. All right, why don't we get started, and we'll start with Alden.
Alden Briscoe, grew up in the East Coast in Connecticut and now live in the San Francisco Bay Area.
Okay, Bill.
Bill Collins, Harvard 63, physics, Navy 20 years, nuclear power and oil and all means of boiling water. And I live in Aiken, South Carolina now, where I worked for a while at the Savannah Riverside, helping to manage the cleanup of residue from Cold War production of nuclear materials.
Okay, Doug.
Doug Shapiro, retired physician and behavioral ecologist, currently living in Louisville, Kentucky, which I thoroughly enjoy.
Okay, and Ron.
Ron Blau, Newton, Massachusetts, class of 63, of course, worked in TV and video all my life, working on a video about how the Massachusetts gas companies are trying to keep us on fossil fuels. No surprise.
Okay. And Roger.
Roger Phillimore, born in the United Kingdom, living in Ireland the last 30 years. My interests are gardening and history.
Okay, and John.
Hi, another 63-year here in Ann Arbor, Michigan, and I'm retired from editing and writing.
Okay, Cindy, Allison.
Yeah, Allison Wardlaw, grew up in Omaha, Nebraska. I now live in Rodden County in the county hills of Tuscany.
Okay, Jerry.
Jerry Secundi in Pasadena, California, environmental lawyer, grew up in crime-free Washington, D.C.
Nick.
Do you say Nick?
Nick, yes.
Yeah. Okay. Nick Bancroft lives outside Boston, Peace Corps after Harvard, and then investments most of the time, settled down, and now still outside Boston.
Okay. David Lelaval.
Also class of 63. I'm a historian of India. I'm in New York City, where I'm from.
Okay. And David Allen.
In Concord, Massachusetts, though, grew up across the river from where Doug is right now in southern Indiana, and my soul is still there. A life across a variety of perspectives, government, academic, business, all those things, but the t-shirt says it all far now.
Okay, okay, great. Jeff.
Jeff Fox, also 63, born in Chicago, sociologist and fiction writer after a long experience in Latin America, now living in southeastern Spain.
Okay, and Liz.
Hi, I'm Liz Morey. I'm Harvard Radcliffe class of 63. I currently live in Tacoma Park, Maryland, just outside of Washington, D.C. But my heart is in California, where I've just spent the last 10 days. So that's enough about me.
Okay, and Kent, Jared Gernander, right, yeah.
Kent Gernander. I'm a lawyer, mostly retired, living in the bluff country of southeastern Minnesota.
Okay, and Connie.
Hello all. class of 63, retired lawyer. I'm now in upstate New York, where everything is in disarray because I've had a lot of remodeling done. And I'm delighted to see that we have another avid gardener in the group. I count myself as one of those.
Okay, and Ham.
Hamp Howell, class of 63, psychologist in Nashville. And I ran a community organizing office in Roxbury, Mass with the Vietnam War. And my it was one big room, and there was I rented half of it to a guy with who was the organizer for CP USA. I didn't love him, but I didn't hate him either.
I have to ask you a question. What's with the eyebrows?
That's some weird thing that the computer does that I don't know how to turn off.
Okay. And Marcy.
I run a nonprofit in New York City, which has been an information center for citizens working to protect and preserve the natural systems and habitats we need for survival.
Okay. And David McNally, welcome. Thank you for joining us, and tell us a little bit about your life and the book.
Okay, well, to begin with, what a treat it is just to listen to all of you go round and describe the trajectories of your lives. It's really a privilege just to be with you today. I am originally born and raised in Toronto, Canada, and
yay for Canada.
Yeah. I started my undergraduate studies in Washington State, which is where I became involved in the movement against the war in Vietnam and in the campaign to free Angela Davis. So that's kind of where I got my social justice leanings. And I came back and completed my doctoral studies in Canada and worked for 30 years at York University in Toronto before the University of Houston came knocking and said they had an endowed chair in history and business and would I like to apply? And 7 years ago, all that happened. And that's where I've been living, working, trying to lend a little bit of help to social justice causes, particularly with George Floyd's family, with the Philonis and Keita Floyd Institute for Social Change. I've been working very closely with them in Houston. So, and this book really comes out of that background in trying to understand the deep structures of racial oppression in our society, particularly the United States, but more broadly, because the book also deals with Britain and the Caribbean and France and its investments in the West Indies. And to think about those deep structures that tied the origins of capitalism in the New World together with racism and racial oppression.
Okay, sounds good. So tell us about the book a little bit more, but what's in it and how it's structured and that sort of thing.
For sure. So the book begins by trying to take some critical distance from the dominant narratives that are out there at the moment in American historical studies around slavery. And really, on the one hand, I'm challenging the late Eugene Genovese's idea that the South of the US was really an aristocratic society, not a capitalist one. And I'm dismissing that. I'm trying to show the evidence that actually, when we look closely, what we discover is that Southern plantations, just like those in the Caribbean, were run as remarkably efficient and brutally disciplined business enterprises. The Harvard historian Caitlin Rosenthal has recently shown, for instance, that in the US, modern accounting systems were more advanced in the South than in the North. These planters were using very advanced accounting to look at output per head in the fields every day, the costs it took to maintain their enslaved labor force, profit per head based on the commodities that they were producing, whether they were tobacco, cotton, sugar, and so on. And in other words, these were modern business enterprises, but using an enslaved workforce. And if we begin to think about them in those terms, these were not aristocratic or feudal type societies. These were modern societies. And of course, that allows me to connect what I'm doing to really two great historians who published massively important works in the 1930s. First, W.E.B. Du Bois and his book, Black Reconstruction in America, because as many of you will know, Du Bois says in that book, what won the Civil War for the Union was the general strike of hundreds of thousands of enslaved people in the South who fled, who left the fields. In other words, as Du Bois puts it, they withdrew their labor. But not only did they withdraw their labor, 200,000 of these newly freed men also contributed their labor to the Union Army and Navy.
That I know.
And played decisive roles in the defeat of the Confederacy. So in suggesting to us that this is a general strike, Du Bois is talking about these enslaved workers not as some kind of feudal peasants, but as very modern workers who are using the strike as a way of exercising their power. Then the second great text that I'm really indebted to is the late C.L.R. James's The Black Jacobins, his story of the revolution in Haiti. And C.L.R. James, too, says to us, it's a memorable quote in The Black Jacobins, working on the giant sugar plantations in their hundreds in Saint-Domingue, which would become Haiti. They were closer to a modern proletariat than any group of workers in the world at the time. Remember, the Haitian Revolution breaks out in 1791. And he's basically saying to us, look, these plantations were among the largest workplaces in the world. They were very complex. They involved divisions of labor, an enormous amount of managerial coordination. So what I'm really trying to do is to build upon all of that earlier history, but of course I've now got 90 years more of historical studies to integrate into that story. So I hope that I'm adding to and updating that story. And as we can maybe come to later, I try to show how all the way from Haiti through to the Civil War in the United States, and this includes enormous episodes in Barbados and in Jamaica, it was very conscious strike action by enslaved people that broke the back of the slave system, that led to emancipation.
Wow.
Emancipation is not primarily a story of British philanthropy or even of Lincoln. It is a story of how enslaved people freed themselves.
So you say it's a new Marxist history. What is that? When you say
Well, both W.B. Du Bois and C.L.R. James were working off a Marxian conception of history in which all of our modern societies, our class divided societies, pivot on the exploitation of labor. They pivot on whether it's feudal lords taking the product of peasants, or whether it's in modern capitalism, where those who do the work, whether they're at a McDonald's or an Amazon warehouse or working for Ford Motor Company, are not paid the full value of what they do. That the exploitation of labor is the infrastructure, if you will, of all class societies. And so that's an insight that Du Bois is using in Black Reconstruction in America. And it's one that C.L.R. James is using in the Black Jacobins. And the central insight, I would say, of that approach is to insist that, look, slavery and exploitation are not just about the psychological viciousness of the slave owning class, although they were vicious. It was primarily driven by the production of global commodities, coffee, tobacco, sugar, cotton, for world markets. And of course, we readily recognize that enslaved labor was exploited labor. And so that emphasis on, which really is heavily indebted with both W.E.B. Du Bois and with C.L.R. James to Marx's so-called historical materialism, to that sense of societies as resting on exploited labor. And so that's the insight that I'm trying to incorporate. It doesn't mean that I need to fit everything into what Karl Marx said about A, B, and C. Of course not. Marx was one finite human being living in the 19th century. It's just really that insight helps, I believe, us see the infrastructure of the exploitation of labor. And it allows me to really use the work of those great Marxian historians, Du Bois and James, to continue to build this narrative. You know, one of the things which is so funny is that in Europe, when I speak with historians and I say these things, they all nod their heads. Because in England, in France, in Italy, they've had major schools of Marxist historiography. But when I speak to North American audiences, they often find this shocking.
Yeah.
And so in some ways, I'm also trying to counter the allergy to thinking about alternative and more radical traditions in history as well. Because as I say, this doesn't shock the Europeans.
Right.
And I speak about this in England or France or what have you. But it still comes as something of a shock to historians in the United States.
Mm-hmm.
Now, didn't Genovese think of himself as a kind of Marxist, but using the old model of feudalism to capitalism, and wasn't that the basis of his argument?
Yes, 100% it was. And I think that's one of the reasons why I try to insist that people using this approach are not all of one cookie cutter school. That is to say, I dissent from Genovese on deep historical grounds. I think he just misreads the evidence and constructs a kind of what I do actually suggest is a cookie cutter.
Could you explain Genovese a little bit? I'm not familiar with him.
Yeah. So going back to what I was saying earlier, Eugene Genovese in the 1960s started to publish a series of books on the American South, on the US South, saying that the South was an aristocratic and feudal society, not a capitalist one. And he claimed that his argument was indebted to Marx. And so it's absolutely true, as David was saying, that this was seen for a long period of time as, if you will, the Marxian approach. And I'm trying to suggest, no, it was one Marxian approach, but with Du Bois, with C.L.R. James and others, there's a very different approach.
Yeah.
And I want to stress that one.
Well, I was thinking of the same thing as you were talking, which is that feudalism also exploited labor.
Mhm.
And it seems to me that the real essence is having rich people who are richer than others, who use the labor of others to get rich. And that doesn't, it's a non-capitalist culture, but it still has the same basic structure of exploitation.
And I think what you're saying is quite interesting there, because one of the things which has helped my approach is that many British historians have pointed out, well, capitalism came to Britain with a lot of aristocratic trappings.
Mm-hmm.
It was people owning these large commodity producing estates who were still called lords.
Right, right.
They retained the monarchy. And yet British historians have said to us the content was changing within these older institutional forms. So that eventually the monarch, for instance, becomes completely subordinated to a parliament run by large landed gentlemen. So the content of the monarchy changes, but they kept a lot of these older aristocratic and monarchical structures in place as a kind of stabilizing function. And
But the
I think the
I'm
South
saying
can be
the
seen
essence,
similarly.
and the essence is exploitation, not
Does
just the
not change.
trappings.
I
Not just the
agree.
trappings. And what about deeply medieval Europe? How does that fit in? I mean, I assume there were still overlords in those
There
times.
were. There were. I think the big difference, and why the South, I think, along with these other historians, why the South can be considered capitalist is that I think we rightly associate capitalism not with a system in which peasants produce directly for their lords.
Mm-hmm.
Lords consume what they produce. In a capitalist society, profit is made not by taking the product and consuming it, but having it transported to global markets, sold
Mm-hmm.
there, and then accruing financial gain.
Mm-hmm.
And so I look at the southern plantations, and like other historians, I see a commodity producing system.
No, I agree. But one final question. I saw a book, or maybe read a review or something, that claims that Southern slavery sort of shaped Northern capitalism by its abuse of workers, et cetera, et cetera. Are you familiar with that? There's somebody who said the cruelty of the South has been imported or shaped the development of even Northern capitalism.
Yes, I agree with that 100%. We too often treat the North and the South as if they were sort of hermetically sealed, as if there was not a lot of movement back and forth.
Like,
And we know that
okay, we'll talk.
some Southern planters and bankers became significant investors in the North. We know that if you look at the large tobacco factories in a place like Richmond, Virginia, they were mixing so-called free wage labor with enslaved black labor. So they had both kinds of laborers in the same tobacco factories or rope
Oh,
making factories and
interesting.
so on. So as you say, these systems aren't cut off from one another.
Mm-hmm.
And because the South was so significant, I mean, I was struck when historians pointed out that if you took 1860 and you took the South on its own, it would have been the seventh largest economy in the world at that point.
Wow, that's interesting.
This was a very significant and dynamic economy, and it was, I agree, influencing the North as well.
Holden.
Well, David, I'm really pleased you're here, because something that I've been thinking about for a number of years is whether slavery was really a good economic system. I mean, it would seem to me that the cost of going and finding these laborers off in Africa, putting them onto a ship, and then losing, I don't know, a third or so in the Middle Passage, and then having them, having to buy them and then support the kids who aren't producing much until they're, I don't know, 12, 14, 15, 16, and then supporting in some way the older people who are no longer working. Not well, you don't have to support them, you have to support them some. That's got to be awfully damned expensive. And would it have been cheaper to simply hire wage laborers to do the work? And I would suspect that the incentive of people who were enslaved was probably not as high as it might have been for someone who was being paid. So that's my question I've been thinking about for quite a while, and maybe you can answer.
Yeah, well, and I'll just take two stabs at it. There's a lovely line in Eric Williams' book on capitalism and slavery where he says at one point, free labor might have been preferable had it been available, but it was not available. And what he means by that is two things. First, that it too had to be imported, essentially, because although in parts of South America, the Spanish did have significant enslavement of indigenous peoples, in North America, this was exceptional. And the reason was essentially the capacities of indigenous societies to resist. They could wage war on their own behalf. And so mass enslavement of indigenous people wasn't available to them. So the workforce was going to have to come from somewhere else. And one of the things we see is that when enslaved people are when free laborers are brought to a place like Barbados, they run away. The term in Britain for penal labor, convict labor, which was brought, white convict labor was brought to Barbados. And so the term was being Barbadosed. In other words, they couldn't think of a more hellish place on earth. Life was short. There were tropical diseases. It was brutally hot, and you were expected to work 12 to 14 hours a day in the fields. So the real problem was that if labor was free, most of it fled. Most of it left. But the other thing we know, because of all the accounting that was done, is that plantations in the Caribbean and in the US South were immensely profitable. I've run as many of the studies as I can, and you're seeing average profit rates of around 8 to 12% per year for sugar and cotton plantations. Some of the most efficient and the most dynamic were doing much better than that. So even though there were all the costs, Alden, that you're referring to, nevertheless, if planters were buying this bonded labor at the price that the actual initial kidnappers and slave companies were making available, whether they were selling it in New Orleans or in Kingston, Jamaica, it was sufficient, the price was sufficiently low and the costs of upkeep were sufficiently low that overwhelmingly these enterprises still made money and were still profitable. And that's why I think it's important to insist that it didn't die out because it was unprofitable as a business enterprise. It died out basically because the resistance of enslaved people made it impossible to continue.
Could you contrast the slavery in places like Jamaica and Haiti with the United States? Because it's my understanding is that those societies had much higher death rates and than in the United States, maybe because of climate and other things. But that made slavery perhaps less profitable. The British ended slavery sooner, not very soon, but sooner than the Americans did. And then they brought in coolie labor from mostly from India, in some of those places, which
That's
was a different system.
There are important contrasts. The one exception I'll make is Barbados. Both Barbados and the US South had self-reproducing enslaved workforces. In other words, the birth rate was more than compensating for the death rate, so much so that although the United States imported about 1 million enslaved people, by the outbreak of the Civil War, there were 4 million enslaved people in the United States. The rest of the Caribbean, with the exception of Barbados, did not have this pattern. And there seem to be multiple reasons for it. One, I think for sure, climate is a difference. Also, sugar cultivation is more taxing, more physically strenuous, more onerous on the human organism than, say, tobacco, even cotton. And outside of pockets of Louisiana and Texas, sugar cultivation in the United States slave system was largely marginal. But the other side of it, of course, is that from 1807 on, there's an embargo on the slave trade into the United States, not on slavery,
Right.
but on the slave trade. So now you've got a problem where the planter class's own interests are in make sure this workforce can reproduce itself. And one of the things that we see is contrary to all the myths that were peddled for a long period of time, all the studies we now have suggest that at least 2/3 of enslaved children grew up in families with both parents. I know that goes against so many of the historical prejudices, but this is one of the reasons why when we look at African American culture in the United States, we can see how durable it is because the Black family was nurturing kinship relations.
That's Gutman's book, the Black Family in Slavery and Freedom,
Exactly.
the strength of the Black family.
Yes, and then Sterling Stuckley comes along and adds to this. But exactly, this was a much more durable family form, in part because they needed the family form, the planters did. But once you allow the family form, and you basically accept the principle that enslaved people will choose their marital partners, which was also the practice, and you essentially look the other way, as the planters did, over enslaved marriages. You recognize the principle of paternity for enslaved fathers, even though it wasn't in the law, and so on. One of the reasons why the deep cultural roots of African American culture are so powerful and so deep and so abiding is because of this family form. And so there is a significant difference, although notwithstanding everything against it, the family was also much more durable in places like Jamaica among enslaved people than we often accept, but it was especially robust in the southern United States.
Ronnie.
Yeah, it seems in this discussion that there's not like a clear, sharp line between feudalism and capitalism. I would think that, let's say in Russia with serfs, wouldn't there be accountants on the large estate that's saying we have to up production? And wouldn't they sell their surplus wheat and things like that on the market rather than just keeping it within the closed system? Also, would the life of the Lord in Russia be that different from a very successful slave owner? I mean, wouldn't one of the aristocrats feel quite at home in the United States if they were invited to a ball?
Yeah. Yeah, no, and Ron, what you're getting at is a really important discussion as well among Russian and East European historians, Polish historians in particular, because many have argued that the kind of pattern that I'm laying out for the US South, that these plantations become giant commodity producing estates, is also happening in the context of the so-called second serfdom in Russia and Eastern Europe. In other words, that while these had historically been the classic self-sufficient estates, that by the 19th century, something that a Polish historian refers to as commodity feudalism
Whoa.
was emerging. And now the historians of Eastern Europe and Russia start to debate, okay, at what point does commodity feudalism in fact tip over into full-fledged capitalism?
Mm-hmm.
Because clearly it does happen somewhere along the line, but of course, as historians, we're going to debate tipping points, aren't we? But nonetheless, it seems pretty clear that commodity feudalism does transition into a kind of full-fledged capitalism. And that's when the accountants that you're talking about start to appear on the scene. They're not there, say, in the late medieval period.
No.
When market selling is marginal.
What is the second serfdom? Is that kind of the tipping point that you're talking about?
Well, historians like to say that there is a wave of revolts against serfdom that, say, for example, the German Peasants' War of the 16th century, with which someone like Martin Luther actually ends up being associated, that coming out of those processes of peasant revolt across Europe, some peasantries got much more independence. France, for instance. But other peasantries experienced a real deep, abiding oppression. They were, if you will, reinserfed. And during that period of reinserfment, as the whole European economy is shifting towards market production, the lords, particularly in Eastern Europe, say, you know what? We've reestablished our power sufficiently that we can also dispossess them from a lot of their own land and start to use this extra land for commodity production, and then draw income from the market as well.
Very
And this is why we're now into a kind of commodity feudalism that does at some point transition into full-fledged agrarian capitalism.
Yeah, and it makes sense after revolutions to do that. After protests, you say, I've got to keep control and I might as well make some money out of it. Yeah, no, I can see that.
John.
Absolutely.
Well, let's see. I remember, if I remember correctly, Martin Luther actually opposed peasant uprisings, and that he was a reactionary in that in some of those struggles, even though he had other things that were not reactionary. But and that gets me to well, it's important to pay attention to the resistance that's ignored or slighted of the African Americans against slavery. I don't think we should do so at the expense of turning away from the anti-slavery movements and their contributions in Britain and in the United States, because if we didn't have powerful and very determined resistance to slavery in some quarters in the United States, I don't think we would have seen the slavery come to the end when we did, would we?
That's a beautiful point, John, and it reminds me of an episode in the 1790s in Jamaica, because it tells us a couple of things, this episode that I'll describe for you in a moment. First, how aware enslaved people were of the abolitionist movement generally. They were much more aware. And
Very.
this is one of the brilliant things about the late Julius Scott's book called The Common Wind.
He was here in Ann Arbor. Yeah.
And I mean, what a book. Anyway, The Common Wind is just so beautiful. And So here you have in a parish in Jamaica in the 1790s, 4,000 enslaved people gather to celebrate the British abolitionist William Wilberforce's birthday.
Yeah, yeah.
Okay, so that's describing, John, exactly what you're saying. They knew about this movement.
Of course.
They understood that it was calling for emancipation. And even though ultimately they had to act for it to happen the ways in which it did, it's not like they were cut off from these wider transnational currents of abolitionism. They were well aware of them. And one of the things, of course, that the late Julius Scott shows us is how important sailors were in this regard. Sailors were bringing stories. Sailors were coming into Saint Domingue and saying, "Do you know they overthrew the king in France?"
Yeah, yeah,
Okay.
yeah.
And therefore, CLR James says, I'm reading about the Black Jacobins now, not the French Jacobins,
Right.
but the Black Jacobins of the New World. So, yes, I fully accept that point.
Doug.
I grew up in Houston, and when I was going through school there, we didn't learn or study anything about world history, European history, or even American history. We studied the history of Texas. And so my question is the history of slavery or even the history of blacks in Texas or perhaps throughout the Southwest identical to that of blacks elsewhere in the U.S., or how would you contrast that?
It definitely has its unique features. One of them, of course, is that slavery comes later to a state like Texas. It's a 19th century development, whereas we can go back a couple of hundred years earlier in, say, Virginia. So it's a later phenomenon, and it means that it tends to move to the giant plantation model, as opposed to, many of the earlier Virginia tobacco estates were really farms. They weren't scale plantations yet. That happens over time. But in a place like Texas, it becomes the large plantation system right away, largely cotton and sugar. But one of the things which is interesting is that we have a variety of historians, Doug, who are rewriting that very history that you were describing. And this allows me to do a shout out to a people's historian in Galveston, Texas, Sam Collins III, because Mr. Collins has pointed out to us, we've started to learn the story of Juneteenth. The story according to which on June 19th, 1865, Union troops arrived in Texas and, quote, told enslaved people that they were free. Now, the reality is they knew.
Of course.
They just couldn't exercise that freedom yet.
Of course.
But what?
So is Trump right? We should get rid of Juneteenth?
Well, listen to the rest of the story and you'll know why he wants to get rid of it. Because Mr. Collins, who's not a professional historian, but he's a seventh generation Black Texan, he's been writing this history. And Mr. Collins, who founded the Juneteenth Legacy Project in Galveston, has demonstrated, and many mainstream historians are now readjusting their history, the majority of those Union troops that landed in Galveston in June of 1865 were United States colored troops.
Oh.
Whoa.
So now imagine the effects of these men of color under arms marching into central Galveston as General Granger reads his orders, including the order declaring absolute equality of all. And the beautiful Juneteenth memorial mural, which is now, thanks to the efforts of Mr. Collins, in downtown Galveston, shows General Granger with Black troops around him.
Oh, didn't know.
To depict that. So it is a different story, definitely, Doug. And yes, even though it was the current occupant of the White House who declared Juneteenth a national holiday, he would like to undo what he did in the aftermath of the George Floyd rebellion. And that's one of the reasons.
I have to say that as an inveterate gossip, I never believed that the slaves in Texas did not know that they had been emancipated. That word would travel in about what in those days 2 days.
Agreed.
It's just ridiculous to think they didn't know.
100%.
Jeff. Oh, yeah. Hi. Well, I just wanted to say this whole discussion has been very stimulating, and you're taking me back to other events and awakening themes in my memory. One of them was C.L.R. James. I met him. He's very impressive. He came to Northwestern University when I was studying there in sociology, and of course we were very impressed by his book Black Jacobins. But then another thing that you may be aware of, I was quite impressed when I discovered in The Guardian, the British newspaper, The Guardian, which used to be called the Manchester Guardian. They did research on their own history, and they revealed how much they depended on slavery because the whole Manchester economy was based on the production of cotton.
Right.
They had Irish laborers, but the cotton they imported had been produced by black slaves, and the Manchester elite was the Manchester rich faction was largely financing much of this exploitation in the South. And one of the things that they did was they were not happy with the London press, so they created their own newspaper.
Oh.
So they created the Manchester Guardian so that they could have their point of view. So anyway, there's an awful lot of documentation that they've made available. It's all online. If you're not aware of it, it's something some of you may want to look at.
No, and it's great that you point that out, Jeff, because it's part of a new reckoning in Britain that historians are now participating in. For a long time, they tried to separate the story of Britain's Industrial Revolution from the slave plantation system, from its colonies. And that's now broken down. There's a much greater widespread acceptance among historians that, in fact, slavery in the New World was one of the engines of the Industrial Revolution at home.
Yeah, absolutely.
Well, coming back to the theme of feudalism and aristocracy, a large part of the British aristocracy were people who made money and became aristocrats. You could buy your way basically into the House of Lords, either by trade with India or by cotton trade or both, or indigo trade or any of those plantations. And a large part of the House of Lords by the 19th century were just first or second generation capitalists of one sort or another.
Absolutely. They looked aristocratic, as you say, but often they were from these non-honorable, non-noble social groups who'd essentially bought their title, bought their way into the House of Lords, become earls and so on, simply because they had the wealth to do so.
And I guess some of the, Americans with their manor houses and so on were imitating that kind of notion. Once you have the money, then you can pretend to be an aristocrat and a feudal lord.
Yes, I mean, one of the chapters in my book is devoted to George Washington. And among other things, not only was he the owner of more than 300 enslaved people, working giant estates in Virginia, but it's very clear he's deliberately mimicking the architectural styles with his own home at Mount Vernon of the British aristocracy. Much of the planter class of that era was almost directly imitative of British aristocracy, who they in some ways saw as their mentors and their ideal.
David Allen.
We'd be tempted to say it's the only aristocracy we have in the U.S., a purchased aristocracy. But John has already noticed for us that there were contemporaneous factors involved, not just, I think, the abolitionists, but the fact that Lincoln was willing to deploy military despite and far beyond any of that. Yours is a startling revelation, David, that the outcome here, the demise of slavery, had to do with the withdrawal of the labor. That was a capitalist event. And once I get that in mind, I notice that we could, you could, more to the point, seamlessly transition that to where we are today in America, where the utter extreme of wealth inequality, in other words, the exploitation of labor in the most extreme form, has led us to likely authoritarianism right now. And I notice that while Marxist thinking is not acceptable in the US, I'd like to explore a little bit of that, but not right this minute. You, in fact, offer the possibility for seeing how, and let's leave Marx out of it, your interpretation of these ideas leads us to a conclusion that's central to where our economy goes today. I couldn't applaud more strongly, and am delighted that Kent has given us the option to hear some of this.
Yeah,
hey, Ken, Roger doesn't know how to raise his hand, maybe, but he's got his hand up. I mean,
so does Elizabeth.
Okay, well, let me just make one quick point on that before we go to the next speaker, because I think one of the things, David, that follows from what you've said is that we need to rewrite modern labor history. Labor history has been written, say, for the United States, as if it didn't include the enslaved people of the South. But when we think, for example, okay, Britain abolishes slavery in its empire in 1832.
Slave trade.
No, the actual abolition of slavery for Jamaica comes in 1832. The slave trade was abolished a bit earlier, and that 1832 abolition follows a strike of 30,000 enslaved people in Jamaica that breaks out in Christmas week of 1831 and continues for several weeks into January 1832. And the leaders of that strike have actually said, if we lay down our tools and do not work, we will bring them to their knees. Well, maybe, as you say, David, that has some implications for any situation of extreme authoritarianism.
Yep.
Could we see that as a principal objective today in activist activities to straighten out where we are? That is a most penetrating insight.
This is, we have one labor leader, and it's Sarah Nelson of the Airline Flight Attendants Union, who has said to all of her cohort, it's going to take a general strike against the president and against the White House to stop this.
Well, we have the most oppressive anti-labor organizing laws of any developed country, so we know why that is. They know on the other side what it will take to bring them down.
Liz, let me get
Liz just break in.
Let me go to Liz.
Yeah, and I have to say this very fast because I have to be off the Zoom in a couple of minutes. I just wanted to go back to your point about the sailors, because there's a personal connection with our Zoom here. Spencer Jourdain, who's not on the Zoom today, his ancestor on his father's side jumped ship, was from the Caribbean and jumped ship, I don't know, 1820s, something like that, and settled in New Bedford. So it would be very interesting to think about other sailors who also jumped ship carrying the good news of whatever sort it was. So that's A. B, if you read Jane Austen, you can see her talking about the people that she's writing about having their plantations in the Caribbean. And it's kind of an interesting way of thinking about Jane Austen. And again, thank you very much. I have to leave the Zoom right now, and I'm just grateful always to Kent and grateful, David, to you, and thank you very much.
Okay, Bill.
Yeah, I just had a small point. I'm not against the celebration of Juneteenth. That's great. But there were still slaves in the United States after that, in Kentucky and I believe Delaware. I don't think slavery ended in those states until the passage of the 14th Amendment.
Yeah.
They were part of the Union, of course. They were not affected by the Emancipation Proclamation because they were not states in rebellion.
Absolutely, yeah.
Correct.
Yeah. Roger.
Oh, yeah. I just wanted to tell a little family story that might interest some of you in terms of an individual's perspective. That an ancestor of mine was born on the slave plantation in Guyana in 1803. His father appears to have been the owner, and his mother was a free colored woman who originally came from Barbados. Now, the father, when slavery was abolished in Demerara, the father was returned to Scotland, where he had a family, and he brought the two boys from Demerara to be educated in Scotland, and then he sent them to Canada to be fur trappers. David, you might have did, and they joined what became the Hudson Bay Company. Now, later in his life, my ancestor James was given the option of settling the island of Vancouver if he could settle it in 5 years by the Crown. He was still factor for the Hudson Bay Company, but he'd been in San Francisco in 1841 under the Mexican governor, and he sent a steamship down to San Francisco to the Convention of Colored Peoples, and through the African Methodist Church, he recruited settlers who came, 800 settlers came to settle Vancouver Island.
Oh my God.
And he had a company of African rifles with which to police the American gold miners who were coming to the Fraser River. He really didn't want them to try and take over there as they'd taken over in Oregon.
Ah.
And yeah, among them was Mifflin Gibbs, who's a great man who, after 12 years in British Columbia, where he entered politics, he then went back to the United States and became a judge and an envoy of President Harrison.
So what happened to the Black citizens of Vancouver? They just melted into the population?
Yes, they formed an honorable, Canada has honored them in 2020 with their contribution to Canadian society. And, they were you see, in California in 1958, they had rights, as you well know, when the United States took over California. testifying in a law against a white man, for instance, and therefore they were given rights in British Columbia, full rights under the law.
Wow. Doug, did you have another question?
Yes. Were all slaves in America blacks, or were there Hispanic slaves or Chinese slaves, or maybe even slaves of American Indians?
European slaves too.
Mm-hmm.
So in the United States, the pattern's a little bit different than we see, say, more in a place like Barbados. In the United States, they try to hold to a distinction between indentured servants on the one hand and slaves. It doesn't always hold up terribly well, but they're trying to maintain the fiction that Europeans who have been sold into bondage are indentured servants. That's usually because they have terms of 3 to 7 years where they're bonded, and after that, they're supposed to get out of bondage. Now, the reality is that the line between that and slavery was not always terribly clear. Indentured servants, for instance, were bought and sold. They were put up for stakes in card games. And very often, for the most minor infractions, they'd have many years added to their indentureship. Let's say they tried to run away. They might have 3 or 5 years added to their indentureship period. The difficulty for that is that in Barbados, what this meant is that from about the 1660s or so onwards, we see united uprisings of Irish servants and African slaves.
All right.
And after a while, the planter class decides, first off, in Barbados, we don't want any more Irish because there's not as many of them available to us as there are enslaved Africans. And then in the United States, there's a deliberate policy of racializing slavery. But in the early period, it's not as clear cut. And there are particularly convict laborers. There are maybe a few tens of thousands of young Irish boys who are essentially sold into slavery in Barbados, for instance. But as the 1600s progress, by the time we get to 1700, slavery is being purely racialized.
Well, you should also realize the whites can run away and blend. It's a very convenient thing to know and trace any black slave anywhere they go.
Right.
And so it's very practical to say, forget about these people who could run away and blend. We want the ones who can never get away.
Well,
and the
they
difficulty
in a way, the Maroons, they had Maroon societies.
Oh,
and some
but they really escaped far, far away. But if you stay within where white people live, you can find them.
Oh, right.
I'll just comment.
And one of the things about when say an Irish servant and a black slave would escape together, picking up on that last point, they could always say, he's my slave.
Right.
Right? It's the Huckleberry Finn story.
Yeah.
You still focus primarily on the eastern half of the U.S. So I guess my question in a way was kind of thinking about what was the story about slavery in the southwestern U.S. or on the West Coast, or
Yeah. On the West Coast, it's much more a story of indentured labor, both indigenous and Chinese. There's not a lot of genuine full-fledged slavery in the areas that become California. But there is a lot of indentured labor. But Louisiana, of course, is pivotal to that Southwest story. And as a result, the Louisiana Purchase by Jefferson becomes critical because it's opening up such a vast area, which has already had experiments with sugar plantations under both Spanish and French dominance before it comes under the United States. And so that's why I think, some historians have said, Doug, and it's an interesting way to think about it, is that Louisiana is as much Caribbean as it is American because of all of those connections to the Spanish and French Caribbean that its history has. And of course, we see that in the culture of a place like New Orleans, don't we? And so you're right. We need to be sensitive to that unique history. I do try to discuss New Orleans and Louisiana generally in some detail in the book. Because of its longevity, though, you're right. There's a tendency to focus more on the eastern seaboard and then rolling down towards Georgia. Um, when we talk about the South, and you're right to insist, it's much wider than that. And as somebody living and working in Houston, I'm reminded of that all the time.
John.
When I saw you were connected with the business school there, I kind of wondered, is that the same person who's in the Haymarket publishing? I thought maybe I thought there must be two David McNallys, but it's the same one. But do you know Gerald Horn down there?
I do indeed know Gerald Horn. He's my colleague.
Yeah.
And in fact, I think only 4 or 5 days ago, John, he interviewed me about the book for his show on KPFA radio.
Oh, great. We want to get him. We're going to get him on here one of these
Good.
days.
Yeah. Who's next? And Bill, you had your hand up?
Yeah, I just wanted to mention a couple of things. First of all, with the West, of course, I saw a PBS program last night, and I kind of knew this before the program, but it focused on, the Kansas-Nebraska Act and Bleeding Kansas and how the Civil War really began in Kansas. The fighting between the Free Staters and the slavery proponents.
Scalawags.
What's that?
No, I just said scalawags.
Yeah. But that was really the beginning of the Civil War in 1750 or so, right? 1850, I mean. Yeah. And the other thing I wanted to mention, of course, a lot of my ancestry is Irish, and the Irish were, the British made a serious attempt to eradicate the Irish. And but they made a very serious attempt. They treated the Irish effectively as slaves in Ireland. Many fled to the United States, and others got, transported to Australia because they were, whatever. And much of Australia was settled by them. But of course, once they're in the overall population, if you look at me, you can't tell that I'm Irish, really.
Yeah. Well, and Bill, there's a wonderful book called How the Irish Turned White.
Right.
Yes.
And the great insight of the book is that even in America, the elites, the ruling class in Virginia and South Carolina and so on, wanted to deny whiteness to the Irish. Okay. And so they used all kinds of racialized terms to deny their whiteness. And of course, that goes back to exactly what you're saying. Ireland is Britain's first colony, and many Virginia planters began as planters in Ireland.
Sure. Yeah.
That's where their first estates were. So this is all part of this transnational story of colonization and slavery in the Americas. Remind me, by the way, because I'll do this towards the end. I did want to say one thing about Liz's point earlier and one point about Demerara, but we'll come back to that.
Okay, let's go with David Allen, and getting to the last question, sort of. Go ahead.
We are indeed. I'm not sure Ham's had a chance, and I have so far. Though I'd like to get in here before we quit.
Yeah, go ahead.
Reaching back to the thinking, the importance of getting your frame of analysis here into modern thinking, and I'll just emphasize how strongly I feel that. I'd like to touch a moment on you're writing from a Marxist perspective. At least it gets identified that way, even though you make your own interpretation. I know from my times in university that there is very much a class structure. Marxists can't get jobs in prominent universities, except in the case in which there's a desire to have a show person. Even then, generally not. Hell, there are layers between the top and Marxists. Marxists are unacceptable. I'm curious how it is being a Marxist in Houston, in Texas. Doug has already pointed out that it ain't exactly a lefty home. But beyond that, that's somewhat, although you come at it from a cosmopolitan Canadian perspective, obviously bringing in European thinking and the rest of it. And yes, it would be fun to hear what you think about that in Houston. That's fun. The important thing is this could be elevated to make a very large impact on economic thinking. I'm a renegade myself in that regard. Hopefully I get a book out to that effect. What your thoughts are on
Yeah, well, let me tell you a little bit about, my pathway into Houston, David, because one of the things that happened among historians in the United States is that when the 2008-9 global financial crisis came along, and as you know, it rocked the global economy. And it's out of the fallout from that crisis that the Tea Party and MAGA emerged, but also, of course, that Bernie Sanders launched his runs for the presidency. There was a growing disillusionment with the status quo. And among historians in the United States, there was a reckoning that they didn't know economic history, that they had no tools for analyzing something like a global financial crisis. And so there was what's sometimes called a return to political economy among historians to ask questions about the production and distribution of wealth and power. And that was the context in which the chair in history and business became available at Houston. And one of the people in that department reached out to me, knowing my first book had been called Political Economy and the Rise of Capitalism, and asked me to apply. And so it was the reckoning with the need to do economic and financial history to understand the ways in which all of our lives are bound up. Think of how our lives are being affected now by trade wars and tariffs. And yet they didn't have the tools to talk about that. One of the things which is really interesting for me is that I find that while Marxian analysis is marginalized in the United States, critical thinking converges with it. And so most of the people who are doing critical work in the humanities and social sciences are often raising what I would call Marxian type questions. And so when I come along and I enter that dialogue, it's a little bit like when I use the term Marxian, it's not because I think there's a Bible, that there's some set series of propositions that you genuflect towards. It's the same way that a biologist would say, I'm Darwinian. We recognize Darwin as the founder of the theory of evolution. And even though Darwin didn't know about genetics, and so Darwinism has had to go through a whole series of new syntheses since Darwin's time. The same for me is true whether we're talking about someone like Freud in the field of psychology or Marx in the field of social and economic history. It's that you're using certain insights as points of departure, not as dogmas, but as
Right.
points of exploration and investigation. And I found that if you explain it that way, that people can be remarkably open, even if it's new to them and sort of strange to them.
And you're pointing out that the construct of political economy has served to bring this thinking forward in the other social sciences. The question is, can we now have an impact on economics itself? I confess that's where my own thinking is, but that's another time. Thank you. So
let's go to Hamp. Hamp, last question.
Yeah. I was wondering, David, if you could quickly work in the sugar plantation economy of slavery by the Portuguese in Brazil. I believe there was much less value on human life and repeating themselves, and they got worked into the ground. But the African slaves were brought there. How else can you tie this into this discussion?
Yes. I don't spend a huge amount of time on the Spanish and Portuguese systems. Partly, I have the limits of language. I can't read properly the original documentation, whereas with the French, I can, and with the British. But also, I see them, as you say, as very brutal. You can see that in all of the practices and the documents, but they're not the innovators of the modern plantation system. They eventually learn to adapt what the British and then the French are doing. But in the early going, outside of mining, where the Spanish are working indigenous enslaved people to death, in Peru in particular, in the great silver mines, but also the gold mines in parts of Peru, Bolivia, Colombia. The Spanish have a system of working indigenous people to death to get precious metals. But when it comes to the commodity producing plantation, producing coffee, sugar, cotton, indigo, tobacco, and so on, the British are the great innovators. And later, in Brazil in particular, we get a transition to that. But for a whole variety of reasons, just like Britain leads the Industrial Revolution, not Portugal or Spain, their empires, and just like Britain becomes the dominant power, the British Empire beats the Spanish, it beats the Dutch, it beats the French, it beats all pretenders and rises to dominance. Similarly, their plantation system becomes dominant. So I try to weave them into a story where the British are the innovators in something that we find abhorrent, the large scale plantation system that then others adapt.
Well, David, thank you so much for coming on. And your book comes out, September 2nd, right? Is the official.
Yes, we're just a few days away. It's actually out there now. And I have some friends who've received it, but the official release date is September 2nd.
What's it called? Say the
It's
name.
called Slavery and Capitalism. And you'll be able to get it on most of the platforms like Amazon. But if you order it directly from University of California Press, use their code UCP Save 30 because you'll get 30% off. So UCP Save 30 at University of California Press. But otherwise, you'll find it on all of the regular platforms like Amazon.
You can pre-order on Amazon very often too.
Yes, and you can.
I'm sorry,
All
say
right, well,
again.
thank
The code
you.
is UCP what?
UCP Save 30.
UCP Save 30.
Save 30%.
All right. Well, thank you for coming on, and we'll
Yeah, very
Listen, I cannot tell you folks how much I've enjoyed this conversation. It's been a total blast.
Yeah, fabulous. Thanks.
Thank you.
Very good. Very good.
See ya.
Thank you. Be well.
That was David McNally. His new book is titled Slavery and Capitalism, A New Marxist History. And that's it for this edition of the Last Negroes at Harvard podcast. I'm Kent Garrett. I will talk to you again next week.